So today we're looking at our John series, and we're looking at chapter 18 today. And it's the night before Jesus goes to be crucified and die on the cross. And this chapter is a real turning point in the narrative. For the past few chapters, Jesus has been with his disciples and he's been preparing them for what's to come after his death and for life when he's gone. And it's been this real intimate moment, almost like they're in a little pocket universe, where it's just them and him. But now they're placed back into the real world, and life goes on as normal. But as this chapter unfolds, what we'll find is that at almost every single stage, there are people who are constantly betraying Jesus or failing to do the right thing. What we see instead is these people choosing comfort over the truth. And I wonder what comes to mind for you when you think of betrayal. Maybe it's the TV series Traitors, or maybe it's Scar throwing Mufasa off the cliff in Lion King. Or maybe you think of a time that you yourself has felt betrayed, or maybe you've betrayed someone. And growing up, some of my cousins lived opposite the Warsaw Arboretum. It's a lovely big park in Birmingham, lots of green space and a nice lake. And we spent many a times there, biking, walking their dog, roller skating, and climbing what I saw to be this massive spiderweb climbing frame. But when I was looking at pictures, I found it was a lot smaller than I actually remember. But it was a lot of fun, and I felt like a giant when I was at the top. But despite those great moments, there was this one thought that's just seared into my mind, that whenever someone mentions this park, it's the only thing that I can think of. And I was about 13 at the time, and I went to the park with my cousin Javan. He's 2 years older than me, and he's much bigger than I am. He's a lot more athletic. But when we get together, we are very impulsive, and we make some very stupid decisions at times. And on this day, we went to the park, and Javan decided he wanted to jump onto this small little island that was in the middle of the park. It's separated by two small rivers and paths either side. And he was like, let's just jump over and see what's over there. Now, again, as I said, he's more athletic. He's bigger than I am. He's quicker, he's faster, he's stronger. So he jumps over, and he just about makes it on the other side of this bank. And I was like, well, I know my limits, and I know for a fact that I'm not going to make it. But then what proceeded for the next 5 minutes is me and my cousin, this back and forth of him firmly adamant that I'm going to make it, and me just like, I'm not going to do it. But then we come to this compromise where he finds this space a bit further up the bank, and it's a bit closer together. Not much, but it's a bit closer. And I was like, okay, fine, I'll jump, I'll do it. And then again, another 5 minutes go by as I'm psyching myself up to do this jump. And then I run, I leap off eventually. And then there's this moment of relief when I pass over the riverbank and my foot lands on the floor. And I'm like, yes, I've done it. But then that moment of relief quickly fades when I realize that my foot has not stopped going down. And what happens is I end up sinking all the way up to my upper thigh on my left leg. I still remember it very vividly. On my left leg, I was all the way up to mud in here. And then maybe about to my knee on my right leg. And it was a very uncomfortable position. And in true fashion, my cousin bursts out laughing. And he's just laughing. He's not helping. He's not doing anything. I'm getting even more and more annoyed at him. I'm shouting at him. I'm blaming him. It's all his fault. And to make it worse, there were people walking by just kind of pointing and laughing. And I might have cried at that point as well. It was a little bit emotional. And there were some people who cared, but not enough to do the jump over to the bank to help me out. But eventually, I managed to get out of the mud and almost lost my shoe a number of times. But we marched back to his house, and the whole time, he was adamant. He's like, it's not my fault. It's not my fault. And it definitely was. But I got in the shower, got washed off, and then hours later, I think what hurt the most is that he told me that when he first jumped, he knew it was a bit muddy and almost lost his shoe when he first jumped. And then when he found the spot for me to jump, he knew it was muddier. There was this betrayal in that moment that I felt, and I can't think of that park without thinking of being stuck all the way up to my leg in the mud, crying my eyes out. And as we start this chapter, we have Jesus going into a garden, not quite the Warsaw Arboretum, but he's in the Garden of Gethsemane. And we're told in verse 2 that this is a place that Jesus would go to with his disciples and meet with them often there. It was a safe place where trusted friends would gather. And Judas was one of these trusted friends. As one of the 12 disciples, he would go there countless times with them. And for me, again, the Warsaw Arboretum was just this small instance of betrayal. Yes, I got a bit dirty and embarrassed. I might have cried a bit, but no harm was done. But Judas's betrayal, this was leading to Jesus' arrest and eventually his death. So how much more does this once special and safe place for Jesus and his disciples become tainted by this act of betrayal? But what would cause such a good friend, someone who is committed to following Jesus, but to be his disciple, want to betray him? What is the comfort that Judas is holding on to rather than to Jesus? And the answer is money. Judas was someone who loved money. In John 12, we read of a story where Jesus is sat around with his disciples, and he's having food at the house of Mary and Martha and Lazarus, and this is Lazarus who he raised from the dead. And during this time, Mary comes out with a small little box, and inside there is some expensive perfume, and she anoints Jesus' feet and his head. And this is Judas's response. Why wasn't the perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wage. Now, on the surface, this can seem like a somewhat reasonable response. So, a year's wage is a lot of money. And look at his heart. He's got a good heart. He's thinking of the poor. It's very nice. But then when we read verse 6, it goes on to say, he did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Despite being one of the 12 disciples and hearing Jesus' teaching over the 3 years of his ministry, witnessing the many miracles that he performed, the desire for money was the thing that took the number one spot in Judas's heart. As the treasurer of the disciples, he had a pretty comfy gig where being able to steal some of the money here and there just to line his own pockets. And it was his greed and desire for money that eventually would go on to lead him to betray Jesus. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26, we read of the same story with Mary anointing Jesus with that perfume. And then just after, we see that Judas, he goes to the chief priest and he says, "What are you willing to give me to betray him to you?" And they set out for him 30 pieces of silver. And from then on, he looked for a good opportunity to betray Jesus. If he wasn't going to be able to get the money from Jesus and his ministry anytime soon because he's letting people waste expensive perfume, and he's hearing these rumors that people are looking for an opportunity to arrest Jesus. And if that does happen, then he's going to be cut off for good. Judas thinks he needs to look after number one. For Judas, his money was the security blanket. It was a thing that he clung onto and put his hope and his trust in. And he isn't alone in that. Many of us in the world today would think and say, if only I had a bit more money, then maybe I'll be a bit more comfortable. And maybe it's not money. It might be power or status. It might be a partner or a family, or if I just got the right grades, then I'll be secure. Then I'll be all right. I'll be satisfied. But the truth is that none of these things will ever truly satisfy us. We'll continue to chase them, and then all these things eventually at some point will fail. They'll fade away. But Jesus is offering us a love and a life that will never fail us, that is everlasting. But here we see Judas enter into the garden. And he's followed by these religious leaders and Roman soldiers. And we're told in other Gospels that Judas indicates which one Jesus is with a kiss on the cheek. And once again, a symbol of love and friendship tainted in this act of betrayal. We see Judas choose the comfort of money over Jesus and his truth. And this brings us to our next group of people who fail to do the right thing, who would rather remain in their comfort than to face the truth. And this is the Pharisees and the high priests. They were religious leaders at the time, and they were the ones who should know the scriptures and the law of God better than anyone. They taught it and made sure it was upheld, following it and all the laws and the rituals to the letter. And especially the high priests, these were the ones who were the representatives of the people to God. They offered the sacrifices on behalf of the community, and they were the example that people would look to when it comes to serving and worshiping God. And throughout Jesus' ministry, we see he has many run-ins and conflicts with the Pharisees. And what we read about is Jesus calling them out numerous times, saying that their worship isn't true worship. that they're more focused on pleasing humans rather than pleasing God. And he challenges them. He challenges them in saying that their hearts aren't in it. They want to be seen to do the right thing. And they rather make sure people see that they're following all the rules to the letter, but their reasons for doing it are missing. Their actions are one of worship, but their hearts were not. And when we gather in church today, we don't sing because that's what we have to do, or because it's a nice tune, or because we've got a great brand, so we might as well use them. We don't just go through the motions and have a little tick box exercise. We do it because God is worthy of all of our praises. And we sing so that we can worship him. In truth, we could sit around and hum together and whistle the whole time, just as long as that we're doing it from a place of worship, and that our hearts are directed towards God in praise. But we see Jesus calling them out many, many times. And then we're seeing people turn and follow Jesus. They're believing the claims that he's making, and this is what causes the Pharisees and the high priest's anger to rise against him. And then they look for an opportunity to kill him. And this is it in chapter 18. And we're going to read from 3 to 14. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink of the cup the Father has given me?" Then the detachment of soldiers, with its commander and the Jewish officials, arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. We're going to come back to Peter in just a moment, but the thing that stands out to me here is the contrast between Jesus and the small mob that's coming to arrest him. This mob of Pharisees and soldiers, they're coming with their torches and their weapons, and they're sneaking around in the middle of the night. Now, they could have easily arrested Jesus in the daytime. They knew who he knew who he was. They didn't need Judas to point him out and say, "This is the guy." They knew exactly who he was. Yet they used the cover of darkness to hide their plans. But what we see is that as they confront Jesus, we see him standing in confidence and in truth, unashamed. He confidently says, "I am he," in response to who they're looking for. And now in the Greek, this is ego eimi, which means I am. And these are the same words that Jesus uses numerous times throughout John's gospel. And when he says this, he's not just saying who he is as a person, but he's making a deep theological statement on who he is and his divinity as God. And the religious leaders, they would recognize these words as they echoes back to the book of Exodus. They wouldn't recognize it as words of God identifying himself. When Moses meets God in the burning bush, God says, "Ego eimi," I am. And whilst the Pharisees and the Roman soldiers are sneaking around at night, hiding their intentions, we see Jesus boldly proclaiming who he is and standing in truth. And once they arrest him, he's brought before Annas, the father-in-law of the high priest, and he's questioning Jesus about his teaching. And from verse 20, it says, "I have spoken openly to the world," Jesus replied. "I have always taught in synagogues or at the temple, where all the Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why do you strike me?" Jesus' opening words here further highlights the contrast between himself and the Pharisees. Whilst Jesus says he's spoken openly and he said nothing in secret, here we see the Pharisees taking Jesus away in the night, holding a secret and illegal trial for him before the high priests. And when they ask him a question, Jesus answers them honestly, and they can't stand it. They hear the truth coming out of his mouth, but it doesn't fit with what they want. It doesn't fit with what they want to believe or their agenda. So they reject it and they strike him. They know they're in the wrong, but they refuse to admit it. And then we see them taking Jesus to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor at the time, the guy in charge with all the power. And the first thing that we're told is that by now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanliness, they, being the Pharisees, did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. And the irony here is that they didn't want to become unclean so that they could celebrate in this festival, yet their hearts were so set on killing someone. Pilate even says to them, take him yourself and judge him by your own law, but because they're actually allowed to arrest people and hold them in the temple jail. But their response was, we have no right to execute anyone. The right thing to have done would have been to take Jesus, to hold this trial in the daytime for all to see, to hold the trial by their laws. But what they wanted was for him to die, to forgo justice and just be killed. They chose the comfort of their own pride over facing the truth that was before them. I think sometimes we can often get caught in that trap of our own pride as well. Sometimes we hear the truth and we're confronted with the truth, but we don't want to hear it. Sometimes we can convince ourselves that we're just so right, and it's like, well, this is the right way to do it because this is how I want to do it. But Jesus confronts us with the truth that brings light in those dark areas. When we try and hide in that darkness, Jesus shines a light in. He doesn't just leave us there. He also shows us a way out, a way back into that freedom. And then we see Pilate talking to Jesus. He takes him inside to question him further. Just as before, Jesus continues to answer truthfully of who he is. And Pilate asked him, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place. You are a king then, said Pilate. Jesus answered, you say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. What is truth? Retorted Pilate. With this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, I find no basis for a charge against him, but it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews? In Pilate's questioning, he's trying to work out if Jesus is a political threat. Is this king coming in? Is he trying to oppose the Roman government or to attempt to overthrow them? But Pilate, like many others at the time, they failed to understand that Jesus didn't come to overthrow governments or raise up armies to take back control by military might. Yes, Jesus is a king, and he doesn't deny this. But what he's saying is his kingdom is far greater than anything this world has to offer. It goes beyond any government or political agenda. And Jesus came so that he could point the world back to the divine truth, which is God. That there is a God who loves us, and though the world has been separated from him and broken through sin, that there is a way back. And that's through Jesus. And he's able to restore us back to life and life in all of its fullness. The truth that Jesus brings, it's not just for the Jewish people either. It's for every single one of us. For us now, for Pilate then. But despite hearing all this, Pilate refuses to believe the truth for himself. And he takes Jesus back out to the crowd that has gathered, and he confesses that he doesn't find Jesus guilty of anything. In the eyes of Pilate and by the Roman law, Jesus is an innocent man, and the right thing for him to do would be to let Jesus go. However, fear of an uprising from the people, he gives them an option to either let Jesus go or a man called Barabbas, who is a known criminal. Pilate chooses taking the easy way out instead of upholding justice. He chooses the comfort of convenience rather than true justice. And we also see a glimpse of the crowd turning and betraying Jesus as they call for Barabbas to be free, the one who actually committed a crime, as opposed to Jesus, who's innocent. And finally, the last person in this passage that I want to look at is Peter. He's another of the 12 disciples and probably the most well-known. He appears the most times in the Bible of all 12 disciples. But from the very start of Jesus' ministry, Peter has been there. Even more so than Judas, he has seen miracle after miracle. He's listened to and wrestled with the teachings of Jesus, and he's brought questions when he didn't understand what he was talking about. But despite not quite getting it right all the time, Peter very much cared for Jesus. And he was a ride or die kind of friend. And this was indicated earlier by him chopping off someone's ear to defend Jesus. Now, Peter would know better than anyone that Jesus isn't about that violent life and he doesn't want to cause anyone harm, so he really should have known better. But it shows how committed to Jesus he is, that he wants to defend him and be by his side. And whilst it's not quite the right thing to do, this isn't the moment I actually want to focus on. It's found a little later in the chapter. It's after Jesus was arrested and he was taken away to the high priest. And in verse 15 we read, Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. You aren't one of the man's disciples too, are you? She asked Peter. He replied, I am not. It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. And we're going to carry on from verse 25. And it says, Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there, warming himself. So they asked him, You aren't one of his disciples too, are you? He denied it, saying, I am not. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. Didn't I see you with him in the garden? Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment, a rooster began to crow. In this passage, despite Peter being so close to Jesus, we see him deny him not once, not twice, but 3 times at different points during this trial. And now Jesus actually predicted that this would happen back in John 13. After he'd finished washing the disciples' feet, gross, and then he goes on to predict his betrayal, and then he goes on to say that he's going to be going away soon. And Peter is like, no, I want to come with you. And Jesus says, you can't come with me. But then Peter asks, Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. Then Jesus answered, will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly, I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And in my mind, Peter is a bit like Donkey if Jesus was Shrek. The best friend who might not have a clue what's going on half the time, but wherever Jesus is going, he's ready to go with him. You know, if Jesus says, I'm going to go here, then Peter's not going to be very far behind. And we see his commitment, his willingness to lay down his life for him. And he's that all-in kind of friend where if you're riding, I'm riding, I've got my sword, let's go. That's Peter. But after Jesus' arrest, this is not the Peter that we encounter. As soon as he is challenged on his relationship to Jesus, he's quick to deny any association with him. And as he enters into the courtyard, instead of going to be near Jesus, his friend, his best friend, stay by his side and help him through this, we see him retreat towards the fires, almost hidden away and to keep his distance from Jesus. He opts for the comfort and warmth of the fire rather than being with his friend and his teacher. Again, why would someone who's such a devoted friend and follower like this, why would he lie like this? You know, one option is he could possibly be fearful of his life. He's now seeing the man that he's followed for the past 3 years in chains, being arrested by the very people who are looking to kill him. And not only that, but moments ago, he just chopped off a guy's ear in front of Roman soldiers, in front of high priests and Pharisees. Everyone saw it, and someone is now calling him out about it. Maybe his worry is that after Jesus, maybe I'm next. And I think it's a very valid and a true concern, and there's that fear that I am next. I'm in trouble here. But if we look at the passage, we see that 2 of the people who actually asked Peter of his relationship to Jesus, they're servants or slaves They're people with no power or authority over him. But also in the garden, all the disciples were free to go. Those people who witnessed Peter chop off someone's ear still let him go, no harm done. In this moment, Peter isn't in any harm's way, and the other disciple that was there was allowed to go in just without any questions asked from the very beginning. But a pastor in America called Johnny Sanders, he suggests that Peter isn't just fearing for his life, but he's also in fear of how others might see him. He's more concerned about what the others may think of him in this moment rather than standing up for his faith in Jesus. And again, this isn't just a Peter problem. Maybe some of us are guilty of denying Jesus this way too. Maybe not so overtly, but maybe when people invite you out on a Sunday, you tell them, oh, sorry, I can't make it, I've got a meeting. But little do they know, it's a church meeting. I know I've used that one many times. Or maybe it's, oh, sorry, I'm going to work out, so I can't make it. But little do they know, it's going to be working out your spiritual muscles at the prayer and worship night. Or maybe people around you, they're gossiping, or they're stealing, they're cheating, they're doing the wrong things. Things that you know doesn't align with what Jesus is calling to do or his followers. Or maybe they're just doing the wrong thing full stop, and you know that this isn't right. But instead of standing in truth, you join in because you're worried about what they might think of you. Whilst Jesus stood out in the cold, proclaiming the truth, we see Peter huddled around the warm fire, declaring lies. Peter chose the comfort of conformity rather than standing in truth. And at every single interaction that Jesus has in this chapter, we see people choosing that comfort over truth. The divine truth that is a loving and redeeming God. And the question and the challenge for us today is, what are the things of comfort in our lives that we're putting before God? What are the number one things on our own hearts that we're confronted with when it comes to stand before truth? For me, one of my biggest struggles at the moment is getting up in the morning. Now, I said to myself that one of the things that I want to do is to get up every morning and spend some time reading my Bible and praying and worshiping, so that this is the first thing I do in the morning, that I can start my day with worship, that if I spend time with God in the morning, anything that follows, good or bad, is fine, because I've got that time with God. I'm set up well. But my issue is that I love my sleep. Now, the first few weeks, it started off fine, it started off well, but then it eventually slipped to, oh, I've missed 1 day a week, or maybe I've missed 2 days a week, and then that 2 days became 3 days a week. And it became a point of, actually, I just want to sleep that little bit more. So I'll snooze my alarm, and then that 5-minute snooze turns to a 10-minute snooze, and then suddenly I need to get up and run out of the house because I'm late. And I counted yesterday, and I now have 16 alarms to wake me up in the morning. It's bad, I know. And Beth, my wife, she's very, very gracious, very patient. And I've got my phone on vibrate, and I think we think we're at the point now where she doesn't hear it all the time, as long as I'm quick enough to get to it. But every now and then, a few minutes go by, and I feel a push or a kick in the back where I clearly have slept too deep. Now, the issue here isn't that I have that many alarms, or maybe that's a separate issue in itself. But the problem here is me choosing myself and choosing my sleep and prioritizing that over my worship of God. Where I think, actually, for me, the most important thing for me is that I get this sleep, not the time I spend reading my Bible or the time I spend praying. And it's something that I am trying to work on. And one of the things to do this is, I said it this morning, I'll say it again. I'm going to try, on a Tuesday morning, 7:30 a.m., we have a prayer meeting here. And I'm going to try and make every single one of those. I've been to some, and they're great. And that was definitely when I first started. But I haven't been to many in the morning since. But I'm saying that, one, to invite you all. Come along, it would be great. Help me pray and worship in the morning. But also for that accountability. So feel free to ask me when you see me next week, how's it going? Or in a few weeks maybe. That's when it's going to get difficult. But Jesus, he came into this world to declare truth. And sometimes that truth can be uncomfortable. It can be challenging, and it can shed light on the wrong that we may be doing. But the question is, are we going to be people who run from it, who try and get cozy by the fire? Or are we going to be the people that stand in truth, in that uncomfortableness? The fire might be comfortable for now, but soon the fire will die out. And all that will be left is with the truth of God. And this is a truth that leads to freedom, and it's a truth that is everlasting.